So, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. Can everyone, well, let me just ask David, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Carry on.
Okay, all right.
I can't see you for some reason.
Can't see me. And Sherry, can you see me?
I can see you. You're fine, and I can hear you.
I can see and hear you, Kevin.
Okay, great. All right, well, hopefully we'll get through the technology side of it without too many difficulties. So Sherry, it's your fault that I'm here and you're at the beach. Is that fair?
Is that a rhetorical question?
Do not pass go, do not collect 200 Rand. But actually, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share some thoughts, and I'm more than a little hesitant, but I agreed because Sherry asked me so nicely. The reason I'm hesitant is that obviously I'm in quite esteemed company, no least being Derek, whose research and presentations are so well considered and professionally put together, whereas mine is a little bit of a wandering and a pondering, and I hope that by sharing that it might just encourage some conversation, which might yield more for all of us as we do this strange hobby of metaphorically digging up the dead. So when Sherry asked me, I thought, well, what is it that I can talk about? And I thought, well, I don't know enough of the technical and factual information. But what I love, and I think what captured my enthusiasm for family history in the beginning, was the stories. And I've been reflecting on that in a variety of different ways and times and places. But why are stories important? And I came across a couple of things on the internet that helped me to put that into words. So I'm going to quote a lady who published a short article on the Family Search website. And she called it "Why Telling Your Story Matters." She said that it's important because it obviously helps to document the story of one's own life. Not only does it help us to remember things that we might otherwise forget, and as we age, that I find becomes more and more common. But what we do remember is not always the big important things. There's sometimes small moments that are very touching. And I think that's what gives a story heart. And that's why everybody has a story worth remembering, I think. Some of them are more startling or more outrageous than others, but when you find a story that moves you one way or another, I'm sure it's a story worth sharing. And this lady goes on to say that she has a desire to tell her story, partly because no one else can tell it as well as you can. She says it's important to share the story because of what it gives to future generations, and I would include in that other family members. My sisters don't do as much family history research as I do, but they love it when I share things with them. And then there are the future generations, and I think it's really important for all of us to know a little bit more about where we come from and what our heritage is. Sharing stories verbally or writing them down also adds to the pictures. A lot of us have photo envy on our family trees. When we see someone's got a family tree with tons of photos or drawings or paintings of ancestors, and others, you know, when we go down those roads that lead nowhere and we don't have pictures. But stories help to flesh out what people were experiencing, and sometimes can convey as much. You know, we say a picture paints 1,000 words, but sometimes the story needs to be heard or needs to be written. So those were the things that inspired me. And I'm going to go to the slides now to see if I can share that. And I just need to see, is there something that I must do to put my slides up on the screen?
Kevin, you must just push the share screen button.
Looking for the share screen button, but
it's
I don't see it.
It's a green button on the bottom, the middle.
Ah, okay. Right, I'm with you. Thank you. There we go. So now you should be able to see my slides and my first slide with the title. And are we in the right place? Is it working?
That's fine. That's fine. First class.
Okay, great. So Sherry gave me a byline of retelling our family histories. And part of what I've just been sharing from that lady's article is that it's not only retelling them, but it's how we tell them in the first place or were told them by other people. And that sometimes we need to untell the story and retell it because we discover something new and unexpected and surprising. And sometimes it's quite fundamental. So I'm going to try and give one or two examples in my family and how those have been meaningful for me. But sometimes we start off with looking at where in the world do I come from? Where do I belong? And there are all of these multitude of places that we could have lived or traveled or that our ancestors came from and relocated. So to some extent, a map is, I find, a useful tool to reflect on. Obviously, the context in time is important because of changing nationalities and circumstances and socioeconomic conditions. Often we look at, I spoke about photo envy, often we look at photos and we might have been lucky enough to inherit boxes of old black and white photos, as you can see I have. And we want to know who was that and why were they doing that and where were they? And that can trigger a sense of curiosity, which I think is a wonderful thing. As adults, we often forget to be curious, whereas children are naturally curious. But there's something with our photos that sometimes we forget, is we don't often see old photos or even old drawings like this one, which has a very different feeling to the grand occasions like these. These tend to be the photos that were taken in the days when photos were few and far between. So one goes from a lonely farmer with, I have to say, a not very neat fence, and whatever conditions he was contending with. That's my uncle's father, who had a farm outside Underberg, to the grand occasions, my grandmother's brother, who was the commissioner of police in Rhodesia and was with family standing outside Buckingham Palace to get his CPE. And so stories can tell us something, but often there's some of the story missing. And I just want to sidetrack a moment to a story that I want to share by way of introduction. Okay, you don't need to see this, but can you see the text? No, okay.
Now, Kevin, there's no text there.
Okay, all right. So here's the story. I experienced the worst customer service that I can tell you about. And I'm not going to tell you the name of the store because I'm not sure how I'm going to proceed. But last night I bought something from the store and I paid cash for it, and I took it home and I found out that it was useless, wouldn't work. So today, less than 24 hours later, I took it back to the store and asked if I could get a refund. And the girl in the store told me flat out, no, even though I still had the receipt. So I asked if I could get a replacement, swap it for another one. And again, she said no. So then I thought, no, well, I'm not getting anywhere. I better talk to the manager because I'm really not happy. And I got the manager and explained I bought this thing and got it home and it just didn't work. And the manager just smiled at me as if I was a little bit loopy and told me to my face that, well, clearly I was just out of luck. So no refund, no replacement. I'm just out of luck. But I tell you what, I'm never, ever going to buy another lottery ticket from that store again. My lottery ticket was faulty. So the story shares a different way of looking at something. Just going back to this, there we go. And some of my story involves growing up in the old South Africa and knowing that some of my family were from England, and then realizing that some of them were also from Ireland. I want to make a comment to Anne and Belfast a little bit later. And then discovering that, oh, well, actually, some of the family ended up in what is now Zambia, which wouldn't have had that flag at the time. And then, of course, South Africa changed. And so part of who I am and where I come from changes, or at least the story changes. And then discover something completely out of the blue, that some of my family are from Germany. And as you can see, each of those flags adds a whole story to my story of who I am. And I want to start with this lady, who is my Granny Dot. That's how I knew her and how I remembered her. She was this young lady who grew up in Claremont, not far from where Sherry lives and not far from where we have our meetings at St. John's when we meet in person. And to me, she was always the epitome of an English lady. She was kind and gentle and very, very caring and generous and loving. Always comfortable hugs to be had from Granny. But this was the family that she grew up in. She's the little girl on the right. She was the eldest of several children. There were only 3 at this point. And that's her mother and father. Her mother died quite young. So I guess that is part of a reason, sort of 2 generations back, to not really know much about someone. But she's the lady who was German. She was descended from a whole band of Moravian missionaries who came to South Africa before any of my English ancestors arrived here. And so she was born into this long line of German missionaries and then married this English chap who we don't know terribly much about, but they lived quite happily, it would seem, in Claremont until she died. And that affected the family quite dramatically. And my granny, being the eldest daughter, became the caregiver and substitute mother to her siblings. And she went on to become a nurse. And while those are factual things, I hope that you can get a sense of some of the emotion that goes with it. A young lady losing her mother, a man being widowed and trying to raise a family. As you can see, the eldest 3 were all girls. And that changes the trajectory of someone's life. Often, I've found in many of us, the eldest sibling who has to care for children has to grow up really quickly, and that affects their life and how often the choices that they have open to them. So that's where the German connection came into my family, and it definitely changed things, because I thought, well, I'd always thought of my family as really English, but so how did they feel when the First World War came along? How did they feel during the Second World War? What did that do to conversations and news broadcasts? Was there such a sense of distance over generations, and the fact that when in that era the world wasn't connected by the internet and telephones the way it is now? Or did they still feel a cultural connection that was at odds with each other? And it's those stories about being at odds with each other that I found quite interesting. So here's another side of my family. That's my great-grandfather, who came from England, was a bit of a wandering soul, carted the family all over the world, searching for a better place to be. But he came from Birmingham. And during his wanderings, he came to South Africa, then he went back to England, then he came back to South Africa with the family, then he took them all back to England again. And then he took his father and set off to go to America. And while he was away, his wife, my great-granny, was pregnant with my grandfather. So their home was Birmingham. But she went to his parents, who had moved to Belfast while she was pregnant and alone. And so my grandfather was born in Belfast, even though they were English through and through, on the Ormeau Road and near the gasworks. And so obviously that changes some of their experience, but it changes particularly what my nationality means, because now I've been fortunate enough to get an Irish passport and Irish citizenship. And yet I've never lived in Ireland. So I'm now both South African and Irish officially, through that quirk of family history and through this gentleman's wandering habits. So then my grandfather was born, and they came back to South Africa, and after living in a tent in the diamond diggings on the Vaal River, my grandfather was very lucky to finish school and come to Cape Town to university on a scholarship, and that's him on the right-hand side with three of his friends fooling around at Maiden's Cove, enacting all sorts of silly scenes, but it's a lovely photo. And here he is as I knew him in later life, with my grandmother, the lady from Claremont, and my cousin. And he particularly is an example for me how circumstance and wealth and educational opportunities and travel change what is important to us. As I've described the travel already, and the educational opportunities, which my grandfather obviously really, really treasured. He only got to go to school because his headmaster wrote to his father, the man with the big moustache, and said, "Mr. Turner, it would be criminal to take your son out of school to go and work on a farm. He's a very talented young man." And because of that, my great-grandfather reluctantly agreed, and my grandfather got to go to university, only for 2 years, but it fostered a love of learning and books, which he passed on to all of us grandchildren. And that gave him choices in his career that his father had never had. And it gave me choices in my career that other people in my family haven't had. And so all of these stories have an influence on who I've become. I want to share another one, which is not my story, but it's a story I like telling because it really embodies the emotion of a story. And I can't see you, so I can't see your reactions. I can see Brenda and Sherry and Doreen. But this is a friend of mine, Marko, who I met in Croatia when I was there on holiday in 2016. And one of the things that happened in my travels was obviously exploring the town. And this is the town that Marko grew up in. It's called Trogir, and it's on the coast of Croatia, very close to Split. So more or less the same latitude as Rome, but on the Croatian coast. And we got chatting about travel, and I asked him about some photos. In the town square of Trogir, there are photos of various citizens from the 1980s who had obviously died during the war that they had in the Balkans in the 1990s or late 80s and into the early 90s. And chatting to Marko, he told me that during that time, he had served in their military. And I told him I had refused to serve in ours. So at more or less the same time in our lives, he was in what passed for a navy in Croatia, and I was doing community service as a conscientious objector in South Africa. The interesting part of his story, though, is that at the end of that breakup of the Yugoslav Republic, he was on his ship doing his last tour of duty, and they were stopping in Istanbul. And the captain of the ship said to Marko, who was an officer, you know, we're not going to come back here again, and we've got an opportunity to make some money. If you come with me, I'll show you a perfume shop where we can buy lots of perfumes and take them back to Croatia and sell them, because you couldn't get perfume in Croatia during the war or shortly afterwards. And we'll make ourselves a tidy little sum. So they duly did this. And the captain's instructions were, you just shut up and let me do the negotiating. I don't want you to spoil our deal, because I've done this before and I know what I'm doing. So you just shut up and bring your money, and I'll make you some money. So they went to this little shop in the Turkish bazaar, and the captain negotiated with the shopkeeper and made a selection of all sorts of perfumes. And when they made the deal and paid for it, the shopkeeper started to wrap up the bottles of perfume so that they could take them with them back to the ship. And the captain then turned to Marko and says to him in Croatian, so Marko Surya, what do you think of that? I told you it would work out. At which point the shopkeeper went as white as a sheet and dropped down behind the shop counter and sort of peered at them like this over the top of the counter, which they both thought was a very strange reaction. And after a moment of uncomfortable silence, the shopkeeper scuttled across to the door and locked the door of the shop and turned to the captain and to young Marko and said, how do you know my name? And the captain said, no, you're mistaken. I'm talking to this fellow. He's my fellow officer. His name is Marko Surya. And the shopkeeper said, no, my name is Marko Surya. And of course, everyone was stunned for a moment. And then they gradually began asking and investigating and working out how is it possible that these two men could have exactly the same name, one a young Croatian Navy cadet and one a perfume shopkeeper in Istanbul. And it turned out that this Marco Surya was the long-lost uncle of the younger Marco Surya. The younger Marco had been named after this uncle, who had been believed to have been killed in the Second World War. Two brothers had gotten onto boats in the Second World War and fled on the coast of Croatia in separate boats. And one boat had been bombed out the water and the other hadn't. And one brother had survived, or so they thought, and one had perished. And now, 50 years later, he was discovering that his uncle didn't die in that Second World War accident. So, of course, there are no telephones. Marco can't believe what's happened. And they get back onto the ship and they head back to Croatia and they land, and he goes back to his family and he says to his mother and father, I've got the most amazing news. I've discovered your brother, he says to his father, Marco, Uncle Marco, he's alive. At which his father promptly punched him in the face and was furious and said, how can you possibly make light of that? You know that my brother died in the war, and you know how I feel about it. And so after much shouting and begging and pleading, he managed to get the story out and explain that no, he had met the missing brother who had explained how he'd survived. And there being no telephones, they'd planned that in 2 weeks' time, on Friday evening, they would place a call from Croatia to the uncle in Istanbul so that the two brothers could speak for the first time in 50 years, which is a really remarkable story of tracing family. And unfortunately, there's a very poignant and sad end in that the family gathered in Croatia that Friday evening and placed the phone call. And knowing that it was all prearranged, they were a little bit surprised when a lady answered the phone. And they said, we're placing a long-distance call from Croatia. This is the Surya family. We want to speak to Marco. And she very sadly said, I'm afraid to tell you that Marco passed away last night. Which was obviously heart-wrenching to have come so close and yet been cheated at the finishing line. And a footnote for us historians and the people who dig through bureaucracy and birth and marriage and death records was that Marco told me he'd decided that at the very least what he could do as a tribute to his long-lost uncle was to get the official record straight and have the official record changed to show that he didn't die in the Second World War, that he died in Istanbul in 1991. And unfortunately, the bureaucracy was such that they just couldn't grasp that someone had not died, but lived, but was now actually dead, and that a death certificate should be changed. And he just never got anywhere with that. So that's another very personal story that I think is a lovely story to share because of its poignancy. It's a true story told to me by the person involved. And yet if that story is not told, imagine losing that story from his family history or from any history of Croatia, of the war, the wars. So I think it's coming back to, it's definitely worth sharing and stories. Then I want to come back to Cape Town. I'm getting a message here saying that my internet connection is unstable. Can you still hear me, Sherry and Brenda? Okay. So this is a photo. Thank you. This is a photo of my grandmother, Peggy, and grandfather, Russell, around the time that they got engaged in 1938. probably on a beach in KwaZulu-Natal, because my grandfather Russell was a farmer outside Maritzburg, and my granny had gone to work at the Old Grays Hospital at Pietermaritzburg. She had trained as a nurse down here in the Cape. She grew up in Fishhook. Her father had been a restaurateur and caterer. At some time, he had run the catering at the Muizenberg Pavilion, and there's still remnants of the old building inside that new building at Muizenberg. Before that, he'd had a restaurant at the top of Solari's Pass, where the viewpoint is, when you stop to look at the view down onto Gordons Bay and Somerset West. But that great-grandfather of mine, my Granny Peggy's father, Victor Huntley, was a troubled man in some ways. He was on his second marriage. He had a new family. There was enmity, I suppose, between some of the old and some of the new family. My grandmother used to catch the train home from school, get off in Muizenberg to visit her half-sisters, spend the afternoon with them, and then get back on the train and go home to her father in Fishhook. And she generally did that 3 or 4 times a week. So she maintained some sort of contact, but it wasn't always easy. Anyway, as she grew up, she went and studied nursing, as I said, and then went off to do her practical nurse training at Gray's in Pietermaritzburg, where she met this young man, became engaged, and shortly after they were married, so not long after this photo was taken, her father committed suicide in the forest at what is now Epping, or Pinelands, taking her young stepbrother with him. So he killed the 2 of them. And there's a scene sort of from vaguely the Epping area, Pinelands area, looking back towards Table Mountain. And whenever I look at that scene, or when I'm in Pinelands, I find a thought creeping through my mind about what those events did to that family. And more recently, when I've suffered bad depression and been on medication and been through counseling for it, I've reflected on my mother and her experience of depression, and then discovered that my grandfather, this man that you see in the photo, also suffered from depression, and that my grandmother had a father who committed suicide because he couldn't face going through another war. He'd been through the First World War, and he couldn't face the Second World War, and he couldn't face allowing his son to grow up and potentially face another war. So those stories, while very personal to me, are connected with world events, and I wonder about things like the family circumstances and the emotions, and I wonder about DNA and the genetics, and how much of that determines who we become and how our stories unfold. And I don't really have the answer, but clearly I have plenty of questions. So moving on to another story, which also is not one of mine, but is a truly lovely story that I'm going to try and summarize, because this is an epic story. It's the story of the little old lady sitting in the middle of this photo. She's surrounded by her 5 daughters and 2 grandsons. And I've met all except the grandson in the purple shirt sitting in the bottom right corner. And he's sitting on the lap of the eldest daughter, who is a very good friend of mine from Durban, Illa Thompson. And a by note of family history research is that Illa told me that her Thompson name, obviously from her father, is actually an assumed name. Her grandfather was actually a turner, and he ran away from home, but his hankies were all embroidered with his initials RT. So he had to keep T as a surname. So he chose Thompson. So there's a little anecdote about another Turner family that became this family. But the story I really want to tell you is a little snippet, a sort of glimpse, maybe the trailer of the movie of Brigitte's life. Brigitte Franz, who's the little lady sitting in the middle. As you can see, she's got a glorious smile. She grew up before and during the Second World War in what became East Germany, a little town called Gardelegen, which war historians might know of. But because that part of Germany became Eastern Germany and was occupied by Russia. Sorry, Doreen, did you want to ask a question? No, okay, I saw your hand up. Because that town was occupied by the Russian forces and became part of East Germany, the children learned Russian, had already, I gather, learned Russian, and Brigitte's father, being a priest and a man of learning, sent her off to court with her sisters to go and practice their Russian translation by sitting in the public gallery at the local magistrate's court and listen to the official interpreter. Well, Brigitte was quite bright and she was quite good at languages. And she came home one day and said to her father, obviously not in English, I was about to say daddy, probably papa, that the court translator is making mistakes. And worse than that, he's not actually making mistakes, he's deliberately lying. He's not translating what the people are actually saying. And in investigation, she explained that he was making it easier for the translator, was making it easier for the magistrate to convict people of things that they probably weren't really guilty of or not guilty at all. So her father, being a priest, went trundling off to the magistrate and said he was unhappy to hear this. And his daughter had transcribed the things that she'd been practicing her translation on. And this is what had been said, and this is how it had been translated. And that was not right. Anyway, that didn't go down very well with the with the Russian occupying forces. And a few days later, a Russian soldier came past their house and said to Father Franz, the priest, "You had better look out for your daughter because they're sending the soldiers to take her away tomorrow morning." So at the age of 16, young Brigitte, the lady sitting in the middle of the photo, was literally that evening bundled up with a hanky with a couple of sandwiches and an apple or two, and sent off at nightfall into the forest to try and get to the next village where her grandparents lived. And the story unfolds like a movie. She went the wrong way. She got close to the Russian camp. She was apprehended or discovered by some Russian soldiers on a night patrol. They didn't know, of course, that she could understand Russian. They took her for a little German girl, and she didn't let on. And she listened to them debating what to do with her. Should they just shoot her and be done with it, leave her in the forest? Should they let her go and pretend that nothing had ever happened? Or should they do what they were supposed to do, which is arrest her and take her back to their camp? And the one soldier said, "No, we can't do that," in Russian. If we do that, we'll be sitting for the next 4 hours filling in forms and reports and answering questions. And I'm tired. I just want to go and have something to eat and go to sleep. And the other guy agreed with him. And so they chased her off and let her go. So knowing which was the wrong direction, she then skedaddled in the right direction and eventually got to her grandparents in the next village, where she hid for a day or several days. They contacted another priest in another village, put her on a bicycle at night, and she rode through the night, got to this other priest who had friends in West Berlin who sent a car to fetch her, and eventually she found herself in Sweden. Lonely, afraid, separated from her family, a young teenage lady, 16 years old. and she found her way to England. Then after the war, got back to Germany. And so her life evolved to meeting this Englishman who had changed his name and getting married and coming to South Africa and having 5 beautiful daughters. And I was very privileged to meet Brigitte and get to know her and read her story that she'd recorded. She'd written a diary for her 5 daughters and printed 1 copy for each of the 5 of them so they could know what she'd been through. I'm not going to go into the wonderful romantic part about how mother and father met, but it's a lovely love story and I think would make an epic film. But that story has obviously very deep personal meaning for these 5 ladies who survived their mother and father. But for me, it's not even my family history, and it moves me. It tells me that the stories need to be recorded. The names on the photos need to be written down and identified, lest we forget. Because they're not just meaningful for the family who are closest, but they are examples and meaningful and oh wow moments for the rest of us. So let me just check on timing. I'm not going to go on for much longer, but this photo Sherry sent me, and this is her story. So Sherry, depending on your connection, I might ask you to tell your story about this photo. Do you want to do that? Because I'm going to have to read it.
Me? If you
yes,
can hear me? Okay. Quite a number of the earlier members of the Cape Town Family History Society will know the story, but I don't tire of telling it, and I certainly hope that you don't tire of hearing it. I always knew that there was a different connection in my family. On my father's side, he used to speak of his grandmother, who you see on the left of the photograph, and how she was a Nama princess. And I don't know if she was a princess, but I grew up as a middle-class white South African living in Cape Town, going to school at a middle-class white school, and never knowing that a certain percentage of my lineage was actually mixed race. And I eventually, through family history, met up with my father's cousins who had long been out of touch with our family. And I got to know a little bit more about Alice Emma Clay. She was born in a tiny village, 16 miles, I think, from Walfish Bay. You can see by her bone structure that she has this Nama connection. Her father was a British man from Portsmouth, which I also only discovered through my family history research. His name was Charles John Clay. I also discovered that he had been married prior to marrying Alice's mother, my great-great-grandmother, whose name was Hannah Kluter, and she was the one who had the Nama ancestry. So therefore, my great-grandmother that you see actually had some half-brothers and sisters, which were a bit of a surprise for all of us. And through absolute serendipity, I had the pleasure of meeting one of Alice's nieces, granted a half-niece, through very, very unusual circumstances. And many of you will know the story that I bumped into an old colleague in the spa at Rosmead once. And he started talking about the fact that his mother had been born in Rooibank near Walfish Bay. And we decided that he was going to check with his mom if she knew my family, whose surname was Hawes. And as I was driving into my driveway, he phoned me to say, my mother says that her Auntie Alice married a Mr. Hawes from England. And so it turned out that this woman in her 90s was my father's half cousin or half cousin once removed, whatever it is. And they had grown up as a coloured family in Wetton, and I had grown up in Meadow Ridge, and yet we were family. And subsequent to that, we have got an even stronger connection in the family, and I have been to visit them. And very sadly, at the age of, I think, 96, my great-grandmother's niece passed away a couple of weeks ago, and I attended her Zoom memorial. She lived a good, long life and left behind a wonderful family that I am friendly with to this day. And that story has changed my life.
Thank you, Sherry. Thanks for sharing that, the photo and the story. Right, go back to my slides. So that brings us to the end of my presentation, and an encouragement really to all of us to continue the next chapters of our stories, and not only to continue exploring, but to continue sharing, because there are so many wonderful stories to tell. And because, like Sherry's just told us, you can meet a colleague in the supermarket and suddenly you discover your family. And suddenly you discover all sorts of things that inform who you are and who you thought your family were. And hence the need to retell our stories sometimes. And then lastly, I am putting myself at the front of the queue with this, but also challenging all of us to share our stories in writing with Derek, so that when the newsletter is put together, we don't rely on him coming up with all of the content. I've made several resolutions to write some of my stories down and send them through for the newsletter, and I've never got round to it. So I'm putting myself in line to do that, and challenging all of us to do that, because it records it and it shares the story. Thank you very much.
Kevin, thank you very much. I'm sure that if anybody would like to ask any questions, it was the most fascinating talk. We all enjoyed it. It's certainly given us food for thought, and of a different sort of concept. For those people that wish to ask a question, you just need to unmute yourself and then fire away. Okay. No questions?
I'd
like to say something, if I may.
Yes.
I'd just like to thank Kevin for a thoroughly fascinating talk. He brought home so many sort of truths about how one should record these things before they get lost in antiquity or whatever. And I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you, Kev.
Yes, here. It was very good. Excellent. Anybody else?
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, David. I just want to chip in while other people are gathering their thoughts or plucking up courage to speak. I want to say to Anne in Belfast, hello, because I'm your new neighbour. Even though I live in Franschhoek, I've tracked down my roots, and I plan to come and visit Belfast again. I went once to go and find the house where my grandfather was born. And subsequently, with the help of Google Maps and all of those lovely things, been able to find photos of houses and streets and cemeteries and so on. But I'm planning to come to Ireland later this year.
We'll definitely get in touch when you come.
Yes, I will. Thank you. Anybody else with any comments, thoughts? Anyone taking up my challenge to write something and send it to Derek before the next newsletter deadline?
I should imagine that Derek should be saying thank you to you for that little punt for himself. I keep on trying. Come on, Derek.
I've got nothing really to add except to say yes, please. I've already got 2 or 3 of my own articles sitting waiting. Seems no one else has submitted. So hopefully I can drop those to maybe the June or September edition, and I get some for March, which is just around the corner. March edition is due. Can I also just comment that all the old editions that I've edited, which has been actually much to my shock and horror since 2010, I've now put on my own website until we can update the Society's website. So if you have written an article in the past, you'll certainly find it there. I will pass on the hyperlink to my website. I'm hoping to create an index, and once I've done that, we might be able to put it onto our Society website. But it does take a bit of time to create an index, so that you type in your family name, it'll bring up 5 or 6 articles that have got the name Smith or Jones or whatever in it. So that'll be quite useful for researchers as well. I think that's what the website should be doing these days, is not so much telling us about the next meeting, but really having a store of knowledge that can be passed on. Facebook, etc., does the telling of the next meeting.
Thank you, Derek.
And thank you, Kevin, for pushing the magazine newsletter. Thank you.
That's a pleasure. And I just wanted to say, David, if I may, I can't see Betty, but I hope Betty can hear me. I'm looking forward to the day when we can meet in person and have tea together again. And Betty may have realized that some of the family history information she gave me from the old days of Salisbury relates to some of those photos that I showed in my slides. Betty, that was my great uncle who was the Commissioner of Police in Salisbury. And Betty gave me the street address at which they had lived.
Okay. Everybody happy? Nothing. Nobody want anything more to say? Once again, Derek, Kevin, very many thanks, and I thank you all for your attendance and for listening so beautifully to Kevin. And we look forward to hearing more stories from you, Kevin.
Okay, will do.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. That's great.